This weekend, once more, we expect more calls for racial equality and police reform. There are thousands of Canadians planning to take to the streets again, demanding an end to discrimination.
No peace! No peace! No peace! No peace!
Some of the scenes that we saw last week. Protests set in motion here by the murder of George Floyd in Minnesota. His death has sparked calls for widespread change here in Canada, particularly when it comes to policing. You're hearing from many protesters. They want to see police services defunded, allegations of systemic racism addressed seriously and meaningfully. And two men are with me this morning who have some very strong opinions on these issues and the future. Welcoming on the left of your screen, Chief Peter Sloly from the Ottawa Police Service, and on the right, Chief Dale McFee from Edmonton Police Service. Gentlemen, it's a pleasure to have you on our program. Thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you, Heather.
Thank you, Heather.
And as we begin, since we're going to be talking about issues of transparency together, we invited you and you accepted our invitation to be here on the condition that you be interviewed together. Now, that is not our norm. So, Chief Sloly, can you explain why you set that?
We've got a chief here in the nation's capital, Ontario. We have a slightly different legislative framework than other provinces. You have a chief in Dale McFee in Edmonton, both major cities, different parts of the country, different cultural elements. I think it's important that your viewership sees different perspectives, but also common ground and common approaches.
Thank you very much. Understanding that, so we will look to both of your experiences and to ideas for the future. We are going to spend a lot of time looking ahead, but I think we need to begin with the events of the immediate past. Chief McFee, let me turn to you. When you saw the video of George Floyd under the knee of that Minneapolis police officer, what was your reaction?
You know, it was like I got kicked in the stomach. It was disgusting. It was by no means acceptable. It was an attack on the profession, an attack on our minority communities and just the communities in general. And it's ultimately nothing to do with professionalism. It's criminal, and it just made me sick.
Made you sick. Chief Sloly, yours?
It was a criminal tragedy, Heather. It's one that affects me as a police professional, as a human being, and as a person who self-identifies as Black. But I will tell you, I'm still proud of policing in this country. It's the best brand of policing anywhere in the world. It is not without its faults. We have individuals who let us down at every level in the institution, and we have institutions that have systemic flaws, not just in policing, but in other parts of society. Our challenge is not to just to identify the bad apples or the bad batch of apples, but to address the entire tree, from the tree top, which is the chief's office, down to the roots, which is the culture.
You know, people listening, I think, will be very happy to hear you say that, because as we bring in some pictures of the protests that we have seen ever since the death of George Floyd, they began immediately. They spread around the world and across our country in such numbers, gentlemen, and really with such strength and unity of voice in delivering the message that you spoke of systemic flaws, Chief Sloly, that there is systemic racism in Canadian policing and the system is, in fact, broken. Do you agree with that, Chief McFee?
Absolutely, and but I think when I say that, I think we got to also focus on, you know, there's a new group of police leadership. I think both Peter and I have been outside of policing and have come back. There's many others, and I think there's great strides. There's obviously big differences in Canada and the U.S. Policing in Canada certainly isn't exempt. I think, actually, I've been working in this space for about 10 years in relation to police reform. It's why I was hired, in particular in Edmonton, and I think there's a lot of work to do. That said, that work has started. That work, I think there's been many positive gains. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. And you mentioned systemic racism, but systemic racism is in our communities. It's in other. It's right across. I mean, it's.
But included in policing. It's important for people to hear police saying that it does exist. Absolutely, you say.
Absolutely.
So, as you say, the work is underway, and in both of your forces, you've already made some concrete measures. But as we look to the future for a new model, but a part of this has come up even in the short term, I was mentioning that in Ottawa last night, the Prime Minister talking to the premiers and territorial leaders about body-worn cameras. And this is something that looks to be figuring in the future. Let's talk about this issue specifically. Chief Sloly, if we could talk about Ottawa. Before you became chief there, they were looking at a business case for body cameras in Ottawa, but didn't go in that direction. And now the service is revisiting the issue. Where do you fall on whether Ottawa should take this up now, and why?
Heather, I made the business case in the Toronto Police Service for body-worn cameras to be piloted there. And I'm very open to revisiting the business case here in Ottawa with the same approach, that we're looking for not a silver bullet solution to the issues of cultural change, institutional change, and advancing the professionalism of individuals. But I'm also not going to stand simply on a silver bullet technology solution. The reviews and research on body-worn cameras is now quite mixed. There are very good cases for it and very strong cases against it. For me, though, I'm looking at bigger changes, changing our entire approach to human resources, who we recruit in, the quality, the diversity, the humanity of those individuals, how we maintain that throughout the course of 30 difficult years of serving and protecting in diverse, dynamic circumstances. I'm looking at our operational approach. We are far too focused on reactive enforcement model of operations, and we need to be far more proactive and effective and integrated in the pre-justice space. Dale McFee is the champion in Canada around integrated policing that works our way out of a job instead of keeping us employed as law enforcers. We are police services, and we are part of a human services group, and that's how we need to operate going forward.
And this is the larger the discussion that people are really wanting to have in this country. I think before we move to that more broadly, can I just get you, Chief McFee, on the issue of body-worn cameras? As Chief Sloly was indicating, I mean, there is some contradictory evidence whether it actually even reduces police use of force. And of course, there are issues of data storage and privacy and cost. Where do you think Edmonton's service could make use or should make use? Because this came up before City Council just this week.
Yeah, you know, and Heather, as you said, I personally don't think body-worn cameras are a good investment, and I'll just give you a short answer why. As Peter said, there's been 70+ reviews done on this. There's a comprehensive review that was just done, an accumulation of the data, bringing it together. And, you know, there's nothing to say that it's improved the relationship between the police and the community. It's a snapshot outward looking. It looks at the other individual, not the officer's misconduct. I think the real answer here is I would rather put that money into training the person behind the camera, the officers, and into the community programs that we've been talking about in relation to have better combined services. Now, that said, I believe, and we are at Edmonton Police Service moving to dash cams in cars. Mm-hmm. Dash cams in cars are usually we respond with a car. It's got a peripheral view with 360 feet of mic. And I think that is a step forward that has some positive gains. So, but that said, if somebody outside of the city or outside of our budget is going to pay for it, would we wear them? Yes. But for us studying this extensively, right now, low value, low impact, and I think we need to really focus on, for us, it's focused on accountability, opening the Police Act, training, recruiting, working with the community, a compassion series of individuals. We brought diversity, equity, inclusion, and harassment right into the Office of Chief, so it remains a priority. We have been working on this area, and that's why I think the chat here and the discussion, which is good, and Peter and I would both agree it is time for change, but we need to do the right things to make sure we keep this momentum going. I think that's the crux of my message.
So many things to talk about. I'm going to put Police Act in reserve for just a second because we've heard that from Vancouver just overnight as well, looking at this. And I know you've indicated, Chief McFee, as this being a good place to start. But when you talk about the new system, let's spend as much time as we can on this. Chief Sloly, what you hear from some people is it's time to defund the police. Maybe this is what you're talking about, but maybe using different wording. What do you interpret that to mean?
Well, first of all, it's completely understandable that in the moments and days and weeks following a tragedy of the proportion that we've seen in Minneapolis and other tragedies across Canada, right here in Ottawa, that people have an extremely emotional reaction to this. That is completely understandable. I had a very emotional reaction to this. And in that reaction, you look for simple phrases and simple solutions to tackle complex tragedies. And so, yes, hashtag defund the police, hashtag disband the police, is something that is trending on Twitter. We had that type of emotional reaction in tragedies in other institutions. We defunded and disbanded the healthcare institutions significantly. We did that particularly around the mental health institutions and psychiatric hospitals. And in the course of 1 decade, we put 95% of the resources out of the system and 100% of the people into community. And basically, there was no capacity infrastructure in the community to deal with it. Guess where it fell to? The police of jurisdiction in small towns and rural villages and in big cities across Canada, and the police are not the right service delivery element for
So
that.
can I just jump in? Can you, sorry, Chief Sloly, Chief Sloly, can I just ask you that? Can I interrupt? I don't mean to interrupt you. Okay, so I just wanted to clarify that point, because that's exactly something I wanted to explore. How much of the work that your officers do is policing, and how much of the work that they're doing now is because of exactly those budget cuts elsewhere that have now fallen to your officers? How much are they dealing with mental health, drugs, poverty, the social and public health issues that you've just outlined? What's the balance and ratio now?
I'm going to answer very quickly, but I think the real answer should come from Dale McFee. I went on patrol with my officers yesterday for a full shift foot patrol in the Byward Market in the nation's capital. And I was told by those officers before we went on patrol, 90% of what they deal with on a day-to-day basis is mental health and addictions. And for 90% of my shift, that's exactly what I experienced as a police chief here. Dale has actual real stats from Edmonton.
So, okay, Chief McFee, to you then. What are the stats that you have compiled?
Well, I mean, if you look at it by priorities, and not all of these are social issues, but we are taking a high proportionate calls of social disorder type calls, and I could certainly give you the call types. But I think the bigger picture here, Heather, is exactly that. Is the answer here isn't to push it from policing, let's say, to a social worker, or to push it to a mental health worker. We've done all this stuff. Like we keep doing this stuff. Nobody's actually changed the structure. And the structure, and having been a deputy minister in government and working on this transformational change file, we've never changed the structure. Like if you think of a front end of the system, and if you stop thinking about it in policing in general terms as an enforcement arm, if the bulk of policing calls for service are about community safety and well-being, well, isn't that the same as EMS and mental health and addictions? Why haven't we restructured? So just a question out there, which, you know, there's a lot of data, and there's law enforcement public health coming out of the UK, which we've seconded a staff sergeant to. But should policing actually even be in the justice system if really what we're trying to do is take stuff out of the justice system? We have authorities to push stuff into the justice system, but if our only authority is to push it into the justice system, somebody's got to take those calls for service. We put police and mental health workers in a car. Edmonton's hiring social workers. We're all doing that. What we can't do, and which is what I'm trying to urge here, is just push it from one entity to another, because we've done that over and over and over. Look at the fundamental structure of what people need for help and then design around it. And if we get that right, we have changed the game. And what we need to really do is put people in the center of that. And there's no doubt, everybody, you know, coming from Métis background, Peter obviously as well coming from minority, this is about people that need help and getting the right help from the first call for service, regardless who is doing it. But all of these things are budgeted from the different place. If you defund the police, that's municipal. So if you push it to mental health, that's provincial. If you push it beyond that, it's federal. But the fundamental system and the funding system is not designed for integration.
So if you say you've done this and you've made moves in the direction that you know you have to go, what, Chief Sloly, is standing in the way then? If there is the understanding there that there is a wholesale structural transformation that has to occur, I mean, is it the union standing in the way, or what has been the obstacle?
No, I want to be clear. I think Dale said it. I'm going to repeat it again. The will and the skill to make change, fundamental and sustainable change, is there. It's in our frontline officers. It's in our senior non-commissioned officers. It's in our senior officers. It's in our boards. It's in our unions. No one is standing in the way. We have a structural inability to move this forward. Municipal budgets pay for policing. Provincial laws create the Policing Act around which we operate. And in many cases, in the laws that we operate under are federal creatures. There are 3 levels of government working on electoral cycles with siloed budgets and different mandates. And guess who gets lost in all that maze? The human being, John Q. Citizen and Jane Q. Citizen in communities across Canada who want something better, can't articulate it, and can't achieve it on their own. Police chiefs across this country who know what we need to do, but we don't have the funding or the legislative framework. We have partners who want to work with us and accomplish this. We're doing it incrementally and ad hoc, but not on scale, because we have not really looked at this from a full-scale societal approach.
Okay.
In Police Scotland, they've done it on a full national basis, and they've had sustained, amazing results. But they've been doing it from a national basis, down through different levels of government, and they've created the funding and the integrated operational model around which they're now operating. We have not done that here in Canada. We need to.
Okay, so Chief McFee, join in on all of that. If, again, this tragedy of George Floyd has caused a national reckoning, an international reckoning, really, in conversation, the structural obstacles that you have encountered may be a willingness to look at those things. What can be done, as quickly as possible in terms of what Chief Sloly was mentioning, the funding, the framework that does not exist? What needs to change from a structural perspective right now?
Well, I think what I've said, ultimately, if utopia is, say, that we had police and public health together, because really that's about community safety, well-being, call it something different, you train different, you actually start to look at things different. If you continue your diversity hiring, you continue to hire bright people, you continue to bring in new thinking, you change the entity. And that's what we're trying to do in relation to Edmonton now. If you look at fundamental differences, though, and Peter articulate that very well, is who responds is reverse engineering. And police have the ability to reverse engineer, and public health has the ability to engineer. In the middle of that sandwich is social services. So unless we start measuring collective outcomes, in other words, that we're going to be measured against each other and collectively together, you end up in silos. And I'm sure that you have been as frustrated as I have hearing that we're always in silos. But the reality is we're in silos because we're structured in silos. And so let's say that's going to take time. What do we need to do to position ourselves to get there? Well, in Saskatchewan, we need Open Our Police Act. We need accountability. Accountability, first and foremost, even under our typical regime here, has to have independent oversight, has to be quick, has to be fair. And also part of reconciliation, when that's done, needs to be held with the police service in a separate entity to do that. We need to train. We should be putting things in recruiting to actually making sure that we're looking for the candidate that obviously doesn't have the bias, that we actually has a great education or perhaps real life experience to get out of that underrepresented communities. In Edmonton, we've done that. We have to work with our community. We need the voice of our community to be in it. We have to make sure that we're listening to individuals and individual circumstances, including the movement. And we need to hold public forums, and we need to actually get this, but we got to look at it as a system. If we're really trying to repair systemic racism, it's a system. That system, and the fingers pointed at the police, which, I think we can take a lot of responsibility in driving the change. And there's some reasons. We're the only autonomous voice. We're the only non-elected voice. And when we're choosing police leaders, as I was given the mandate coming back into this position, it was to drive change. And I've got a commission that's 100% behind me and our service to do that. It's going to take a lot of heavy lifting, but we got to measure the early wins to get there, because people are frustrated, they're mad, they're angry, but they have the right to be. What is done is wrong. But the reality is, to change systemic racism means that you got to look at the system inclusive, but that's going to take time. So I've just given some early wins, and we've got lots of others that I think we can do. But we need to measure those, and we need to report out on those, and we need to bring all voices of our community to the table. So this is a an inclusive move forward, and it's not just something, to Peter's point, where we throw money at it. I mean, we've done this too often. You know, we get a fentanyl crisis, we focus on fentanyl. We have something in marijuana, we focus on that. But even in Saskatchewan, or sorry, in Alberta and Saskatchewan, it's meth here that's driving it. Focus on the people that are caught up, and don't focus on the particular, if it's a drug or if it's a firearm, if it's whatever it is. We have to start putting the people at the center of this.
And what about, Chief Sloly, is there anything with police culture, as we refer to it? Is there anything that also has to change as part of this?
I like Dale's analogy. We tend to focus on the harm as opposed to the source of the harm and the people who are most harmed, their experience. You know, if we can address systemic racism, guess what? We can address systemic homophobia. We can address systemic gender bias. We can address the larger underpinnings of the dark part of the police culture while elevating the good part, the amazing parts of the police culture. Compassionate professional individuals who on a 24/7, 365 coast-to-coast basis keeps Canada one of the safest, most democratic countries anywhere in the world. Are we satisfied with what we've achieved in terms of reform and in some cases, actual transformation? No, so much more needs to be done. But focusing on one issue, one institution, one aspect of that institution is at best a feel-good exercise that might actually result in more harm than good. And we need to take a systems approach, a countrywide approach. There needs to be standards from Victoria to St. John's. There needs to be an integrated approach in small towns that works in small towns, that works in big cities. And it has to have a legislative and financial framework that it's sustainable over the course of electoral cycles at all three levels of government.
So who takes the lead on all of that reform then, Chief Sloly? What are next steps? All of you, all of the forces together.
All of us do. All three levels of government, all three levels of elected officials, all police chiefs, all oversight bodies, all Solicitor General's offices and ministers, and yes, community leaders who actually have to have the biggest voice at the table. We are not afraid of hearing criticism. We're not afraid of discussing change. We're not afraid of listening to the tragic lived experiences of the people in Canada, and the people here in the nation's capital. What we must resist is, out of fear, thoughtless, unplanned, big moves that will create more problems than they will solve. We are willing to come to the table. We're at the table in every jurisdiction across this country trying to find those solutions. We now have a burning platform. Our responsibility as Canadians, every Canadian, is to take the burning platform and turn it into an opportunity for real change, needed change, sustainable change.
Chief McFee, I'll give you the last word on all of this because I'd like to know what your thoughts are. I mean, it sounds like you're proposing some sort of, a total national summit on policing and with all of those different players that you mentioned at the table. But your next steps, and I'm also, in answering this, I'm wondering if you could also address the issue of the future, this relationship with police and racialized communities has been strained, but something new has broken with this George Floyd incident. And I'm wondering, as you look to the next steps that you would propose, how long, if ever, can you before you recover from what has been done?
Well, Heather, first of all, I'll go back to what Peter said, and you mentioned at a local level as well. So we've got the provincial and national. I think police need to lead this on a local basis, but we need to lead it and not own it. And that's the problem. We generally start to own things that maybe we can't solve, but we always go to these calls. So we need to lead and get the right people. And we're starting to fund ourselves to bring in social workers and stuff, and PAC teams and mental health workers, which many cities do. But we got to get out of the ownership and the leadership business at this. Now, back to the relationship fracture. Yes, it is fractured, but it's been fractured for a long time. There's been lots of good work, and it's the times like this that those relationships that you built with these communities are going to get you through it. Is it going to be a kick in the in the stomach to set you back? Absolutely, it is. But losing's not an option. This is about our kids and our grandkids. They're 30% of our population and 100% of our future. Anybody that doesn't think that the system needs change, I think needs to take a hard, reflective look in the mirror. And, people accuse, say, a Peter or I of being defensive. Let's just use those examples. We're not defending the fact that policing needs to change and be different. What we're really trying to defend is the how. And we've both been working in this space, as many others have, and others in other sectors as well, including our hugely valuable not-for-profits that do a lot of this work for all levels of government. But somebody's got to cohesively, and I said this the other day, think of policing as the electricians. We've built a lot of houses, but it's time to maybe start wiring them together, because nobody has put in the wire and the connectivity. And that's the problem that we have right now. We look at outcomes in isolation. There's been thousands of death inquests in this country that have said professionals need to share information better. We haven't done it yet. You know, there's been how many lives lost that say we need a new approach. And George Floyd just obviously compounded this. This can't be lost. This is our moment in time, like anything else, and it was compounded with COVID-19. And we all know that budgets are under strain, and we all know that every entity is going to feel that strain. But I can tell you from some of the experiences I've had in pretty much going across the country, including the federal, provincial, territorial deputy ministers, I think at the time it was like 6 ministries in government: health, social services, education, advanced ed, justice, the employment and the economy, spend 80 to 89% of every budget. The money is in the system. The outcomes are not coming out of the system because we measure what we take in and not what we get out to independence. So when we talk about this, if we isolate it to one entity, we don't solve the problem. We're just pushing it down the road and feel good that we've done something. This is our dividing and our pinnacle in time to get underneath our minority and in our other communities. It's not, you know, they're extensive. Our business communities are struggling, and everybody. We need all these voices to come together and say, how do we have the best value and impact for the quality of our citizens and keep them safe and look after their well-being? This is about community safety and well-being, which includes policing.
Chief McFee, I have to leave it at that, and Chief Sloly, I have to leave it in that, but I've enjoyed every moment of listening to you on this, and obviously this is a conversation. If you'd come back, we'd welcome you both to carry it on, because as we listen to all of the issues and your expressed willingness to, among other voices, to tackle all of these, as you say, this seems to be a moment that no one is going to back away from and wanting to see tremendous transformation. Thank you very much, gentlemen, for that time and conversation. Peter Sloly, the Chief of the Ottawa Police Service, and in Edmonton, Chief Dale McFee.